Hey there, plant lovers, and welcome back to Botanic Haven. I'm so glad you're here with us today. This channel is all about gardening, taking care of your plants, and creating those beautiful green spaces both inside your home and out in your yard. Whether you're growing tomatoes on your balcony or nurturing a fiddle leaf fig in your living room, we're here to share practical tips and real experiences that actually work. Today we're diving into something that I've seen trip up so many gardeners over the years, and honestly, it caught me off guard too when I first started getting serious about soil health. We're talking about soil problems that look completely normal on the surface, but are secretly blocking your roots from growing the way they should. You know what I mean? Everything looks fine, the soil seems okay, but your plants just aren't thriving the way you expected. Let's get into it and figure out what's really going on beneath the surface. So, picture this. You've prepared your garden bed, added some compost, planted your seedlings, and you're watering regularly. Everything should be perfect, right? But weeks go by and your plants are just sitting there, not really growing, maybe looking a bit pale or stunted. You dig around a little and the soil looks normal enough. It's not bone dry, it's not sitting in water, it just looks like regular dirt. This is where things get tricky because some of the most damaging soil problems are invisible to the casual observer. They're hiding right there in plain sight, and unless you know what to look for, you'll keep wondering why your garden isn't producing the way your neighbor's does. I learned this lesson the hard way about 5 years ago when I had this whole row of peppers that just refused to grow beyond 6 inches tall. The soil looked fine, felt fine, but something was definitely wrong. That's when I started really digging into soil science, and wow, did I discover some eye-opening stuff. The first hidden problem that's incredibly common is soil compaction. And I'm not talking about the obvious hard-packed clay that you can barely get a shovel into. I'm talking about compaction that happens gradually, layer by layer, until you've got what's called a hard pan, somewhere between 6 and 12 inches down. This is especially sneaky in garden beds that have been used for years. Every time you walk on the soil, every time it gets rained on and then dries out, every time heavy equipment drives nearby, you're creating tiny amounts of compression. Over time, these add up to form a dense layer that roots simply cannot penetrate. The crazy thing is that the top few inches of your soil can look absolutely perfect. It's loose, it's crumbly, you can work it with your hands easily, but underneath, there's this barrier that's stopping roots from going deep. And here's why that matters so much. Plants need deep roots to access water and nutrients during hot weather and dry spells. Without that ability to go deep, your plants become stressed much more easily, they're more vulnerable to temperature swings, and they just can't reach their full potential no matter how much you fertilize or water from above. My friend Daisy dealt with this exact problem in her vegetable garden last season. She'd been growing in the same raised beds for about 7 years, and suddenly her tomatoes, which had always been amazing, were producing these tiny, sad fruits. The plants themselves weren't getting very big either. She asked me to come take a look, and at first glance everything seemed normal, but I grabbed a metal probe, just a long screwdriver basically, and started pushing it into the soil at different spots. In most places it went down easy for about 8 inches, then hit something firm. That was the telltale sign of a hard pan layer. What had happened was years of tilling to the same depth, combined with foot traffic around the beds, had created this compacted zone that was acting like concrete for her tomato roots. The solution wasn't quick or easy, but it worked. We used a broad fork to break up that compacted layer without turning the soil completely upside down, and we added a thick layer of compost on top. By the next season, her tomatoes were back to their former glory, producing these beautiful, huge fruits again. The difference was incredible, and all because we addressed a problem that looked totally normal from the surface. If this guide has helped you, write 1 in the comments, and if not, write 0. This way, I'll know which tips are most useful for your garden. Now, let's talk about the second sneaky problem, and this one is particularly frustrating because it often happens when you're trying to do the right thing. It's about soil pH being off just enough to lock up nutrients without showing obvious signs of distress. Most gardeners know that plants prefer certain pH ranges, but what many don't realize is that even a half-point difference can make essential nutrients unavailable to roots. Iron, manganese, phosphorus, and other crucial elements become chemically bound in forms that plant roots can't absorb when the pH is wrong. The tricky part is that this doesn't always show up as dramatic yellowing or wilting right away. Instead, you get slow, underwhelming growth. The plants don't die, they just never really take off. They look okay, maybe a bit pale or stunted, but nothing that screams emergency. Meanwhile, you're fertilizing regularly. The soil has plenty of nutrients in it, but those nutrients are basically locked in a chemical safe that your plants can't open. I saw this play out with Oliver, a guy who grows blueberries in large containers on his patio. He'd read all the guides about blueberries needing acidic soil, so he bought acidic potting mix and planted his bushes. Everything started out great, but by the second year, the growth had really slowed down. The leaves were pale green instead of that deep, healthy green colour, and he was getting very few berries. He kept adding more fertiliser, thinking the plants were hungry, but nothing improved. When we finally tested the soil pH, it had drifted up to around 6.8. Which doesn't sound that different from the ideal 4.5 to 5.5 that blueberries need, but it was enough to lock up the iron and other nutrients. See, his tap water was slightly alkaline, and over time, that constant watering had gradually raised the pH of his potting soil. The organic matter breaking down had also contributed to the drift. We corrected it by switching to rainwater for irrigation and adding sulfur to bring the pH back down. Within a month, the difference was obvious. New growth came in dark green and vigorous, and by summer he had more berries than he knew what to do with. The lesson here is that pH isn't a set-it-and-forget-it thing. It changes over time, and regular testing, maybe once or twice a year, can save you a lot of frustration. The third problem that looks deceptively normal is what I call the nutrient imbalance trap. This happens when your soil has plenty of nutrients overall, maybe even high levels according to a basic test, but the ratios are all wrong. Too much of one nutrient can block the uptake of another, even if both are present in the soil. The classic example is when there's too much phosphorus, which can interfere with the absorption of zinc and iron, or too much potassium, which can block magnesium uptake. These imbalances often come from years of using the wrong fertilizer or adding too much compost without understanding what's already in your soil. The frustrating thing is that a basic soil test might tell you that everything is present and adequate, but it won't always flag these ratio problems unless you're looking at the detailed analysis and know how to interpret it. Your plants end up showing deficiency symptoms, even though the soil is technically rich in nutrients. It's like having a pantry full of food, but not being able to reach half of it. Rose experienced this in her ornamental garden where she grows dahlias and delphiniums. She's always been a really conscientious gardener, adding compost every fall and using organic fertilizers throughout the season. But over the past 2 years, her dahlias started developing this weird intervenal yellowing pattern on the leaves, which usually indicates iron deficiency. She couldn't understand it because she'd been fertilizing regularly and the soil was dark and rich-looking. When she got a complete soil test done, it showed that phosphorus levels were through the roof, more than triple what plants actually need. All that compost she'd been adding was high in phosphorus, and it had accumulated over time. That excess phosphorus was chemically binding with iron in the soil, making it unavailable to her plants even though iron was present. The fix was to stop adding phosphorus-rich amendments and start using a chelated iron supplement until the levels balanced out naturally over a couple of seasons. She also added some sulfur to slightly lower the pH, which helps iron become more available. It took patience, but her dahlias gradually returned to health, and now she's much more careful about understanding what's actually in her amendments before she adds them. Here's the fourth hidden problem, and this one really surprised me when I first learned about it: poor soil structure that prevents proper air exchange. Roots need oxygen just as much as they need water and nutrients. In fact, roots can drown in soil that stays too wet because the water displaces all the air spaces, and the roots suffocate. But here's the thing: you can have soil that drains reasonably well and isn't sitting in puddles, yet still has poor aeration. This happens when soil particles are too fine and uniform, without enough variation in size to create those little air pockets and channels that roots need. Clay soils are obvious culprits here, but you can also get poor aeration in sandy soils that have lost their organic matter, or in raised beds filled with low-quality soil mixes that compact quickly. From the surface, everything looks fine. The soil isn't waterlogged, plants aren't wilting, but root growth is severely limited because there's not enough oxygen getting down there. Roots become stunted and shallow, which then makes plants more susceptible to drought stress and nutrient deficiencies. I remember visiting Ivy's garden where she was trying to grow carrots and kept getting these short, stubby roots instead of the long, straight carrots she wanted. The soil looked fine, nice and dark from added compost, and it wasn't wet or dry to any extreme. But when we dug up a few carrot plants and really looked at the roots, we noticed they were barely penetrating past 4 or 5 inches. Below that depth, the soil felt oddly dense, not hard exactly, but really tight and compact. We did a simple test by digging a hole about a foot deep and filling it with water. It drained okay, not super fast, but not pooling either, so drainage wasn't the obvious problem. But when we examined the soil structure closely, we could see there were very few visible aggregates or clumps. The particles were all kind of uniform and tightly packed together. What Ivy's soil needed was better structure, which means creating more varied particle sizes and stable aggregates that hold together but leave spaces for air and water movement. We worked in a combination of compost and some perlite to increase porosity, and we also added a cover crop of radishes that she tilled in before replanting carrots. Those radish roots helped break up the tight soil and create channels. The next season, her carrots grew beautifully, long and straight, because the roots could finally breathe and expand properly. The fifth and final hidden problem is one that doesn't get talked about enough. Biological depletion, or basically dead soil that looks alive. Healthy soil is teeming with life. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, earthworms, and countless other organisms that break down organic matter, cycle nutrients, and create soil structure. These organisms form networks that help plant roots access nutrients and water more efficiently. But soil can look perfectly normal, dark and crumbly while being biologically dead or severely depleted. This often happens after years of using synthetic fertilizers without replenishing organic matter, or after soil disturbance like construction or heavy tilling. It can also happen if you've used pesticides or fungicides that killed off beneficial organisms along with the pests. Without that living ecosystem, plant roots struggle even in soil that chemically tests as having adequate nutrients. The plants can't form beneficial relationships with mycorrhizal fungi. They can't access nutrients that are locked in organic forms, and the soil structure starts to degrade because there are no living organisms binding particles together. Lucas learned about this when he moved into a new house with an established yard that looked great on the surface. The previous owners had maintained a very manicured landscape with lots of chemical inputs. When Lucas tried to start a vegetable garden in what seemed like decent soil, his plants performed terribly despite careful watering and fertilizing. Everything just looked weak and struggled to grow. He sent a sample to a lab that does biological soil testing, not just chemical analysis, and the results were shocking. The soil had almost no fungal biomass, very low bacterial counts, and basically no protozoa or other microorganisms. It was like trying to grow in sterile potting mix. The solution was to rebuild the soil biology, which takes time but really works. He stopped using any synthetic fertilizers or pesticides, started adding compost tea and worm castings regularly, planted cover crops to feed soil organisms, and added wood chips as mulch to provide habitat and food for fungi. It took about 1.5 years, but the transformation was remarkable. His soil went from this lifeless medium to a thriving ecosystem, and his vegetable production just exploded. Plants that had struggled before were now healthy and productive, and he was dealing with fewer pest and disease problems because the soil biology was helping protect the plants. Understanding these 5 hidden soil problems has completely changed how I approach gardening and how I help other people troubleshoot their plant struggles. The key takeaway is that soil health goes way beyond just making sure it's not too wet or too dry, or adding fertilizer when plants look hungry. Real soil health involves physical structure, chemical balance, and biological activity all working together. When any of these factors is off, even if things look normal on the surface, your roots can't do their job properly. And if roots can't grow and function well, nothing else you do, whether it's pruning or fertilizing or choosing the right variety, is going to give you the results you want. It all starts with the soil. So what should you do if you suspect one or more of these problems in your garden? First, get your soil tested. And I mean really tested, not just those cheap, color-changing strips. Spend the money to send samples to a good lab that will give you detailed information about nutrient levels, pH, and if possible, biological activity. Second, observe your plants carefully and look for patterns. Are problems showing up consistently in certain areas of your garden but not others? That could indicate localized compaction or pH issues. Are all your plants struggling regardless of what you plant? That suggests a more systemic problem like poor soil structure or biological depletion. Third, do some physical investigation. Use that screwdriver test to check for hard layers below the surface. Dig up a plant carefully and look at the root system. Are roots growing deep or staying shallow? Are they white and healthy or brown and stunted? These observations will tell you a lot. Once you've identified the likely problems, solutions usually involve a combination of immediate fixes and long-term soil building. For compaction, you need to mechanically break it up with tools like a broad fork, and then prevent it from happening again by avoiding walking on beds and keeping soil covered with mulch or cover crops. For pH problems, you need to adjust gradually using lime to raise pH or sulfur to lower it, and then maintain it by being mindful of your water source and the amendments you add. For nutrient imbalances, sometimes the best approach is to stop adding fertilizers for a while and let the soil rebalance naturally while using foliar feeding to address deficiencies in the short term. For poor aeration, work in materials that create air spaces like compost, perlite or aged bark, and consider using permanent beds to minimize compaction. For biological depletion, the solution is organic matter, and more organic matter, along with time and patience to let soil life rebuild. The really encouraging thing about all of this is that soil can be healed. Even if you're dealing with multiple problems, even if your soil has been mistreated for years, you can turn things around with the right approach. It won't happen overnight, and you'll need to be consistent, but soil is remarkably resilient when you give it what it needs. I've seen gardens go from barely producing anything to being incredibly productive and healthy just by addressing these underground issues that nobody was paying attention to. And once you've built truly healthy soil, maintaining it becomes so much easier. You'll use less fertilizer, water less frequently, have fewer pest and disease problems, and your plants will just thrive with minimal intervention. Before we wrap up, I want to share one more quick story that really brings this all together. A community garden near where I live was struggling for years with poor production across most of their plots. Different gardeners tried different approaches, some organic, some not, some with lots of amendments, some with minimal inputs, but almost everyone had mediocre results. Finally, the garden coordinator organized a comprehensive soil assessment of the entire site. What they discovered was fascinating. The garden had been built on land that was previously a parking lot, and although the parking lot had been removed and soil brought in, there was still a compacted layer of subsoil about 10 inches down that was preventing deep root growth. Additionally, the fill soil that had been brought in was depleted and had very poor biological activity. Armed with this knowledge, the whole community came together for a workday. They used machinery to break up the compacted layer across the entire garden, then added truckloads of compost and organic matter to jumpstart soil biology. They established permanent pathways to prevent future compaction and implemented a garden-wide cover cropping program during the off-season. The transformation over the next 2 growing seasons was incredible. Yields went up dramatically across almost all plots. Plant health improved, and gardeners who had been ready to give up were suddenly having their best years ever. All because they looked below the surface and addressed the real problems instead of just treating symptoms. Now, I want to talk about something that ties all these soil problems together, and that's the interconnected nature of soil health. What I've learned over the years is that these 5 problems rarely exist in isolation. They tend to compound each other and create cascading effects that make everything worse. For instance, soil compaction doesn't just block roots physically, it also reduces aeration, which kills off beneficial soil organisms, which then leads to biological depletion. Once the biology is depleted, organic matter stops breaking down properly, which further degrades soil structure and can throw off nutrient ratios. Similarly, when pH is wrong and nutrients become locked up, plants grow poorly and develop weak root systems, which means they can't penetrate compacted layers or survive in poorly aerated soil. It's all connected in this complex web of cause and effect. This interconnection is actually both bad news and good news. The bad news is that fixing one problem might not be enough if multiple issues are present. You might correct your pH but still have poor results because compaction is limiting root depth. The good news is that improving one aspect of soil health often has positive ripple effects on other aspects. When you add organic matter to improve structure and aeration, you're also feeding soil biology and helping to buffer pH changes. When you break up compaction, you're allowing better water infiltration, which helps prevent waterlogging and improves aeration. When you rebuild soil biology, those organisms help create better structure, cycle nutrients more efficiently, and even help regulate pH through their metabolic processes. So while the problems are interconnected, the solutions are too, and investing in comprehensive soil health pays dividends across multiple areas. I've also noticed that many gardeners, especially those just starting out or those who learned gardening from older generations, tend to think of soil as this static thing that you just add fertilizer to when plants look hungry. But soil is actually a living, dynamic system that's constantly changing. The biology is eating and reproducing and dying. Organic matter is breaking down and releasing nutrients. pH is shifting based on what's being added and what's being taken away. Structure is either improving or degrading based on how the soil is managed. Understanding this dynamic nature is crucial because it means you can't just set things up once and forget about them. Soil management is an ongoing process of observation, adjustment, and maintenance. One practical tip that has really helped me stay on top of soil health is keeping a garden journal where I note not just what I planted and when, but also observations about soil conditions, any amendments I added, test results, and how plants performed. Over time, this creates a valuable record that helps me spot patterns and make better decisions. For example, I might notice that a certain bed consistently produces poorly in the second half of summer, which could indicate that nutrients are being depleted faster than I'm replacing them, or that compaction is building up and needs to be addressed. Without that written record, it's easy to forget details from year to year and keep making the same mistakes. Another thing I've found incredibly valuable is connecting with other local gardeners and sharing experiences. Soil problems can be very region-specific based on the type of native soil, climate patterns, and common gardening practices in your area. Learning from neighbors who've been gardening in similar conditions for years can save you a lot of trial and error. They might already know, for instance, that local soil tends to be deficient in a particular micronutrient, or that certain amendments work better than others for addressing common problems. Local gardening groups, whether online or in person, can be goldmines of practical, location-specific wisdom that you just can't get from generic gardening books or websites. I also want to emphasize that while all these soil problems can seem overwhelming, especially if you're discovering that your soil has multiple issues, the process of healing soil is actually deeply rewarding. There's something incredibly satisfying about taking depleted, problematic soil and transforming it over time into this rich, living medium that practically grows plants on its own. The first time you dig into soil that you've been working on for a season or two and find it full of earthworms with this beautiful crumbly structure and that earthy smell of healthy soil, it feels like a real achievement. And then seeing how your plants respond, how much easier gardening becomes when the foundation is right, that's when you really understand why soil health matters so much. For those of you dealing with really challenging soil situations, maybe heavy clay that's been compacted for decades, or sandy soil that's been depleted and eroded, don't lose hope. Some of the most productive gardens I've seen started from truly terrible soil. The key is patience and consistency. You might not transform everything in one season, but every improvement you make is a step in the right direction. Start with the most critical problem, the one that's limiting growth the most severely, and address that first. Then move on to the next issue. Layer your improvements over time, and before you know it, you'll have soil that's dramatically better than when you started. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. These 5 soil problems that hide in plain sight and block root growth, even though everything looks okay from above. Compaction beneath the surface, pH levels that are just off enough to lock up nutrients, nutrient imbalances that create deficiencies despite abundant soil fertility, poor soil structure that limits aeration, and biological depletion that leaves soil technically alive but functionally dead. Each of these can seriously limit your gardening success, but each one is also fixable with knowledge and effort. Remember that these problems are interconnected, that soil is a living system requiring ongoing attention, and that patience and consistency are your best tools for creating truly healthy soil. I hope this helps you think about your soil in a new way and gives you some ideas for troubleshooting those frustrating situations where plants just aren't performing the way they should. Thanks so much for spending time with me today here on Botanic Haven, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy gardening, everyone! So that's what I wanted to share with you today, these 5 soil problems that hide in plain sight and block root growth even though everything looks okay from above. Compaction beneath the surface, pH levels that are just off enough to lock up nutrients, nutrient imbalances that create deficiencies despite abundant soil fertility, poor soil structure that limits aeration, and biological depletion that leaves soil technically alive but functionally dead. Each of these can seriously limit your gardening success, but each one is also fixable with knowledge and effort. Remember that these problems are interconnected, that soil is a living system requiring ongoing attention, and that patience and consistency are your best tools for creating truly healthy soil. I hope this helps you think about your soil in a new way and gives you some ideas for troubleshooting those frustrating situations where plants just aren't performing the way they should. Thanks so much for spending time with me today here on Botanic Haven, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy gardening, everyone!